Sometimes the past finds you when you least expect it, no matter how far you run or how deep you bury it. Stone Wolf had spent his final years believing he'd finally found peace in the Arizona desert. The old Apache scout lived alone in his cabin, with just his eagle, Ghostwing, for company. Every morning, the bird would hunt and bring back food to share. But one day, Ghostwing brought something different, a human tooth, then another tooth the next day, and more teeth after that. Stone Wolf had tracked for the army for 30 years. He knew what old violence looked like. These teeth were telling him a story, leading him somewhere he didn't want to go. His faithful eagle was showing him something buried in the desert, something that had been hidden for years. What terrible secret was his eagle trying to reveal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Arizona mesa in shades of copper and gold, casting long shadows across the weathered sandstone that had become Elijah Stone Wolf Red Crow's sanctuary. At 68, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen too much and chosen to see no more. The cabin he'd built with his own hands sat perched on a ledge overlooking miles of empty desert, far from the sounds of civilization and the weight of memory. Stone Wolf moved with the careful deliberation of age, but his eyes remained sharp as flint. Those eyes had tracked Apache through mountain passes, followed Confederate deserters across scorching flats, and read sign that most men would miss entirely. For 3 decades, he had served as a scout for the United States Army, bridging 2 worlds that seemed destined to destroy each other. Now, in the silence of his chosen exile, he tried to forget the bridges he had helped to burn. The cabin was sparse but comfortable, built from local pine and chinked with desert clay. A single room served as kitchen, bedroom, and sanctuary, with a stone fireplace that had warmed many cold desert nights. On the mantel sat his medicine pouch, a worn leather bag that held the sacred items of his Apache heritage, alongside the military medals that marked his service to the white man's army. The contradiction had once torn at his soul. Now it simply existed, like the scar on his left shoulder from a Comanche arrow or the missing finger on his right hand from a saber fight outside Fort Huachuca. Ghostwing perched on a wooden post outside the cabin, preening his dark feathers in the morning light. The golden eagle had been Stone Wolf's companion for 7 years now, ever since he'd found the bird as an injured fledgling in a canyon wash. Most men would have seen the eagle as wild, untamable, but Stone Wolf understood the language of wounded things. He had nursed Ghostwing back to health with patience and respect, never trying to cage or control the magnificent bird. In return, Ghostwing had chosen to stay, hunting the desert by day and returning each evening to share the silence with his human friend. The old scout stepped onto his porch, feeling the familiar ache in his joints that came with mourning and age. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a landscape he knew better than the lines on his own palms. Every canyon, every hidden spring, every game trail had been cataloged in his memory during his years of service. He had tracked enemies and allies across this unforgiving terrain, reading stories written in bent grass and displaced stones. But those days were behind him now. Stone Wolf had walked away from the army in 1879. After the last of the Apache wars had ground to their bitter conclusion. He had seen enough death, enough betrayal, enough of what men could do to each other when fear and hatred took the reins. The final straw had come during a patrol near the Mexican border, when he had been ordered to track a band of Apache families fleeing the reservation. He found them, as he always did. But when the soldiers arrived, what followed was not capture, but slaughter. Women and children cut down without mercy, their bodies left for the buzzards while the officers wrote reports about dangerous hostiles eliminated. That night, Stone Wolf had removed his scout's insignia and dropped it in the dust. He had served faithfully, believing that his skills could help prevent bloodshed, could find peaceful solutions to impossible problems. Instead, he had become complicit in atrocities that haunted his dreams and poisoned his waking hours. So he had walked away, using his army pay to buy this remote piece of land where he could live according to the old ways, in harmony with the bay desert that had shaped his people for countless generations. Ghostwing let out a sharp cry and took flight, his powerful wings catching the morning thermals as he rose toward the sun. Stone Wolf watched the eagle soar, finding peace in the bird's effortless mastery of the sky. This was their routine. Ghostwing would hunt the desert while Stone Wolf tended to the simple tasks that kept life moving forward. By evening, the eagle would return with prey to share, and they would sit together in comfortable silence as the stars emerged. The old scout's memories drifted back to his childhood in the Chiricahua Mountains, when his grandmother had taught him to read the signs that lesser men ignored. She had been a woman of great wisdom, keeper of the old stories and guardian of ancient knowledge. From her, he learned that every creature had its place in the great web of existence, that the eagle was a messenger between the earth and sky, and that a man who could understand the language of animals would never truly be alone. His Apache name, Stone Wolf, had come to him during his vision quest at 15. For 4 days and nights, he had fasted on a sacred peak, waiting for the spirits to show him his path. On the final night, as delirium and revelation blurred together, he had seen a wolf emerge from living stone, its eyes glowing with ancient wisdom. The wolf had spoken without words, telling him that he would walk between worlds, that his feet would follow many paths, but his heart would remain true to the earth that birthed him. The vision had proven prophetic in ways both bitter and sweet. Stone Wolf had indeed walked between worlds, serving as interpreter and guide for the American military while trying to preserve what he could of his people's way of life. He spoke English without accent, understood military protocol, and could read the intentions of white officers as clearly as he read animal tracks. But he had never forgotten the lessons of his grandmother, never abandoned the ceremonies that connected him to his ancestors. The sun climbed higher, driving the shadows back toward the canyon walls. Stone Wolf moved through his morning routine with the methodical precision of a man who had learned to find meaning in simple tasks. He checked his water barrels, tended to his small garden of corn and beans, and repaired a section of fencing that kept his few goats from wandering too far into the desert. Each task was performed with the same attention he had once given to tracking, every detail observed and catalogued. His hands, weathered and scarred but still steady, worked with practiced efficiency. These hands had held weapons and peace pipes, had signed treaties and dug graves, had touched the faces of dying soldiers and blessed newborn children. Now they sought only the quiet satisfaction of honest labor, the simple pleasure of maintaining his small corner of the world. As the morning wore on, Stone Wolf found himself thinking about Ghostwing's recent behavior. For the past week, the eagle had been acting strangely, flying in unusual patterns and crying out at odd hours. Birds, especially intelligent ones like eagles, often sense things beyond human perception. His grandmother had taught him that animals were the Earth's early warning system, their instincts finely tuned to disturbances in the natural order. The old scout paused in his work, scanning the horizon with eyes that had tracked enemies across impossible distances. The desert appeared peaceful, unchanged, but something felt different. It was a sensation he recognized from his military days, that prickling awareness that came just before an ambush or the discovery of hidden danger. His Apache senses, dulled by years of peaceful retirement, began to sharpen once again. Stone Wolf had spent nearly a decade trying to forget the skills that had made him legendary among both his own people and the soldiers he served. But those abilities remained, buried beneath layers of chosen silence and deliberate solitude. The tracking instincts, the ability to read sign and sense hidden threats, the warrior's awareness that had kept him alive through countless dangerous missions, all of it lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be called upon once more. He looked up to see Ghostwing circling high overhead, the eagle's cries carrying an urgency that made the old scout's pulse quicken. Something was stirring in the desert, something that had captured his companion's attention and refused to let go. Stone Wolf felt a familiar chill run down his spine, the same sensation he had experienced on the morning of his last patrol, when instinct had whispered of approaching violence and hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. But those days were behind him now, he reminded himself. He had chosen peace over conflict, solitude over service. Whatever secrets the desert might be whispering, whatever shadows might be stirring in the distant canyons, they were no longer his concern. He was Stone Wolf, no more just an aging Apache trying to live out his remaining years in quiet harmony with the land that had shaped him. Yet as he watched Ghostwing's agitated flight, Stone Wolf could not shake the feeling that his peaceful retirement was about to come to an end. The second tooth arrived 3 days later. Stone Wolf had convinced himself that the first one was an aberration, perhaps something Ghostwing had found while scavenging in an old cemetery or battlefield. The desert was littered with the remains of those who had tried and failed to conquer it. Prospectors, settlers, soldiers from a dozen different conflicts. A single human tooth, while unsettling, could be explained away. But when Ghostwing dropped the second tooth at his feet during the morning feeding, Stone Wolf felt the familiar chill of recognition that had served him so well during his tracking years. This was not random scavenging. This was deliberate. The second tooth was different from the first, smaller, more worn, with a distinctive crack that spoke of years of hard use. Stone Wolf examined it carefully, his weathered fingers turning the yellowed enamel in the morning light. The wear patterns told a story. This had belonged to someone who chewed tough meat, someone who had lived hard and survived on frontier rations. The crack suggested violence, perhaps a blow to the mouth that had damaged but not dislodged the tooth. Over the next 4 days, 5 more teeth arrived. Each morning, Ghostwing would return from his hunting flights and deposit his grisly offering in Stone Wolf's feet before settling down to share their usual breakfast of rabbit or prairie dog. The eagle's behavior remained otherwise normal, but there was something in his amber eyes that spoke of purpose, of a mission that only he understood. Stone Wolf laid the 7 teeth out on his rough wooden table, studying them like artifacts from an archaeological dig. They varied in size and condition, but all showed the same characteristic wear of frontier life. More disturbing was the fact that some appeared fresher than others, as if they had been protected from the elements until recently. Someone or something had disturbed the burial site, and Ghostwing had found it. The old scout's instincts, dormant for nearly a decade, began to stir like embers touched by wind. He found himself studying Ghostwing's flight patterns, noting the direction the eagle took each morning and the approximate time of his return. The bird was flying southwest, toward the maze of canyons that cut through the desert like ancient scars. That region was largely unexplored, a labyrinth of red rock and hidden valleys that few men had ever penetrated. Stone Wolf knew those canyons better than most. During his army days, he had tracked Apache raiding parties through that twisted landscape, following trails that seemed to vanish into solid stone. The terrain was treacherous, full of dead ends and hidden dangers, but it also contained secrets that the casual observer would never discover. Sacred places known only to his people, hidden springs that could sustain life in the harshest conditions, and burial grounds that had been old when the first Spanish explorers arrived. On the 8th day, Stone Wolf made his decision. He rose before dawn and prepared for a journey into the canyons. His old army pack came down from its dusty shelf, and he began filling it with the supplies he would need for several days in the desert. Water was the most important consideration. The October heat could still kill an unprepared traveler, and the hidden springs were known only to those who had learned their locations through years of careful observation. As he worked, Stonewolf felt the familiar tightening in his chest that had always preceded dangerous missions. Part of him welcomed the sensation, the sharpening of senses that came with purpose and risk. But another part, the part that had grown comfortable with solitude and silence, whispered warnings about sleeping dogs and buried secrets. He strapped on his old hunting knife, its leather handle worn smooth by decades of use. The blade had taken lives during the Apache Wars, both in battle and in mercy, ending the suffering of wounded men on both sides of the conflict. Now it would serve a different purpose, helping him uncover truths that someone had clearly wanted to keep hidden. Ghostwing watched these preparations with what Stonewolf could only describe as approval. The eagle's posture was alert, expectant, as if he had been waiting for his human companion to finally understand the message he had been trying to convey. "So, you want me to follow you, old friend?" Stonewolf murmured, checking the straps on his pack. "You want to show me where these teeth came from?" The eagle cried once, a sharp sound that seemed to pierce the morning stillness. Stonewolf shouldered his pack and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. The desert was alive with the sounds of creatures ending their nightly hunt, coyotes calling from distant ridges, the rustle of small animals seeking shelter from the coming heat. Above, the stars were beginning to fade as the eastern horizon showed the first pale hints of approaching sunrise. Ghostwing took flight without ceremony, his powerful wings carrying him southwest toward the canyons. Stonewolf followed on foot, his pace steady but unhurried. He had learned long ago that the desert rewarded patience and punished haste. Better to arrive safely and late than quickly and dead. As he walked, memories surfaced unbidden from the depths where he had tried to bury them. Images of other tracking missions, other mysteries that had led him into dangerous territory. He remembered the faces of soldiers who had trusted his instincts, officers who had relied on his ability to read sign and interpret the land's hidden messages. Most of those men were dead now, casualties of war or victims of the frontier's casual violence. But he also remembered the times when his skills had prevented bloodshed, when his ability to find hidden camps or secret trails had led to peaceful negotiations instead of battles. Those memories were fewer but more precious, moments when his dual nature had served the cause of understanding rather than conquest. The sun climbed higher as Stonewolf made his way toward the canyon country. The familiar rhythm of long-distance walking settled into his bones, and he found himself automatically checking for sign as he moved. Old habits died hard, and despite his years of retirement, his eyes still caught the subtle indicators that most men would miss: the bent grass that marked the passage of animals, the scratches on stone that told of recent use, the almost invisible trails that connected one water source to another. By midday, he had reached the edge of the canyon maze. The landscape changed abruptly here. Flat desert giving way to a complex network of gorges and mesas carved by millions of years of wind and water. Red sandstone walls rose like ancient fortifications, their surfaces painted with the mineral stains that created the desert's distinctive palette. Stonewolf paused to rest in the shade of an overhanging rock, studying the terrain ahead with the careful attention of a man whose life had often depended on such observations. The canyons stretched for miles in every direction, a maze that could easily swallow an inexperienced traveler. But somewhere in that labyrinth, Ghostwing had found something that demanded investigation. The eagle circled overhead, his cries growing more urgent as they approached their destination. Stonewolf shouldered his pack once more and began the careful descent into the canyon system. Each step required attention. Each handheld needed to be tested before committing his full weight. A fall here could mean death, or worse, slow dying while the desert sun burned the life from his body. As he made his way deeper into the maze, Stone Wolf felt the weight of the past settling around him like a familiar cloak. The skills he had tried to forget were returning unbidden, his senses sharpening to catch every nuance of his environment. The tracker was awakening, and with him came all the memories and ghosts that Stone Wolf had spent 9 years trying to escape. Whatever Ghostwing had found in these canyons, whatever secret lay buried in this remote corner of the desert, Stone Wolf knew that his peaceful retirement had come to an end. The past had found him at last, and there would be no running from it this time. The canyon floor told stories that Stone Wolf wished he couldn't read. 3 hours into his descent, following Ghostwing's increasingly agitated flight patterns, the old scout began to notice signs that made his blood run cold. Scratches on the canyon walls that spoke of metal scraping stone. Depressions in the sandy floor that suggested the passage of many boots. Most telling of all, the subtle discoloration of rock that came from old violent stains that rain and time could fade, but never completely erase. Stone Wolf knelt beside a cluster of stones that had clearly been disturbed and rearranged. His fingers traced the edges where someone had dug, not recently, but not so long ago that all trace vanished. The digger had been systematic, methodical, searching for something specific, or perhaps burying something that needed to remain hidden. Ghostwing landed on a ledge 20 feet above, his amber eyes fixed on a narrow side canyon that branched off from the main gorge. The eagle's posture radiated urgency, and when Stone Wolf made no immediate move to follow, the bird cried out in obvious frustration. "I hear you, old friend," Stone Wolf murmured, rising stiffly from his examination of the disturbed ground. But rushing has killed more men than patience ever has. Still, he could feel the pull of discovery drawing him forward. His tracking instincts, sharpened by decades of reading the land's hidden messages, were telling him that whatever lay ahead would change everything. The sensation was familiar yet unwelcome, the same mixture of anticipation and dread that had preceded some of his most significant discoveries during the war years. The side canyon was narrow, its walls rising on either side like the ribs of some massive buried creature. Stone Wolf moved carefully, his experienced eyes cataloging every detail. Here, protected from the worst of the weather, the signs were clearer: boot prints in protected sand, some military issue, others civilian. The prints overlapped in ways that suggested multiple visits over several years, but all were old, at least a decade, possibly more. What disturbed Stone Wolf most was the evidence of systematic excavation. Someone had spent considerable time and effort in this hidden place, digging with purpose and covering their tracks with professional skill, but not quite professional enough to fool someone with his training and experience. 20 yards into the side canyon, Ghostwing led him to a section where the wall contained a natural shelf about 8 feet above the floor. The shelf was partially concealed by a fall of rocks that looked natural, but showed subtle signs of human arrangement. Stone Wolf studied the formation with growing unease, recognizing the handiwork of someone who understood concealment, but had made small mistakes that only an expert tracker would notice. He began carefully moving stones, working his way toward whatever lay hidden behind the rockfall. Each stone was placed with deliberate care. This was not random collapse, but careful construction designed to hide something from casual observation. As he worked, fragments of memory began surfacing, images of other hidden caches he had discovered during his army years. The smell hit him first. Even after all these years, even filtered through layers of stone and desert air, the distinctive odor of old death clung to the hidden space. Stone Wolf had smelled that scent too many times during the Apache Wars, had breathed it on battlefields and in abandoned camps where violence had visited and moved on. It was the smell of secrets that demanded to be told. Behind the stones, he found a natural cave that extended back into the canyon wall. The opening was just large enough for a man to crawl through, and the darkness beyond revealed nothing to casual inspection. But Stonewolf's trained nose detected more than just the smell of death. There was the metallic tang of corroded metal, the musty odor of rotted fabric, and something else that made his stomach clench with recognition. He brought an oil lamp for just such discoveries, and now he lit it with hands that remained steady despite the growing certainty that he was about to uncover something horrific. The lamp's warm glow pushed back the darkness, revealing a chamber that nature had carved from the living rock over countless centuries. What he found there made him understand why Ghostwing had been bringing him teeth. The cave was a repository of death, carefully arranged and methodically concealed. Human remains lay scattered across the rocky floor, some still partially clothed in the rotted remnants of frontier clothing. But these were not the random bones of travelers who had died from natural causes. The arrangement spoke of violence and deliberate concealment. Stonewolf forced himself to examine the scene with professional detachment, applying the skills that had made him legendary among both Apache and cavalry. The bones told a story of systematic murder, victims who had been killed elsewhere and brought here for burial. The clothing remnants suggested a mix of civilians and military, men and women, even children. But it was the military artifacts that made Stonewolf's blood freeze in his veins. Scattered among the bones were pieces of cavalry equipment belt, buckles, uniform buttons, and most damning of all, a tattered cavalry guidon bearing the distinctive insignia of a unit he knew all too well. The colors were faded and torn, but the eagle and crossed sabers were still visible, along with part of the unit designation that made his hands tremble: 7th Cavalry. Stonewolf sank to his knees beside the hidden banner, his mind reeling with implications. The 7th Cavalry had been stationed in Arizona Territory during the final years of the Apache Wars, and he had worked with them on several occasions. They had been led by officers he knew, men he had shared meals with and guided through treacherous terrain. But the evidence before him suggested something far darker than the usual casualties of frontier warfare. This was systematic murder, carefully concealed and deliberately hidden from official scrutiny. Someone had used this remote canyon as a dumping ground for victims who had been killed, not in battle, but in cold blood. Worse still, the presence of civilian clothing among the remains suggested that American soldiers, had been murdering non-combatants and hiding the evidence in this natural tomb. The scope of the atrocity was staggering, and the careful concealment spoke of a cover-up that reached high into the military hierarchy. Stonewolf's mind raced through the possibilities, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with his memories of the men he had served alongside. Had he unknowingly helped track victims for these murderers? Had his skills as a scout been used to facilitate atrocities that went far beyond the legitimate operations of war? The questions brought back memories he had tried to forget, times when patrols had returned with fewer prisoners than expected, occasions when civilian settlements had been found mysteriously abandoned, reports of Apache raids that never quite made sense. At the time, he had attributed such inconsistencies to the chaos of war and the unreliable nature of frontier communication. Now he wondered if he had been willfully blind to evidence that would have revealed the truth. Ghostwing's cry echoed from the canyon entrance, sharp with warning. Stonewolf extinguished his lamp and moved quickly toward the cave mouth, his warrior instincts taking over. Someone was coming, and given what he had just discovered, he doubted their intentions were benign. The past had indeed found him, and it was bringing violence in its wake. Stonewolf pressed himself against the canyon wall, listening to the approaching voices with the heightened senses of a man whose life had often depended on such skills. 2 riders, maybe 3, picking their way carefully down the main canyon. Their voices carried clearly in the desert stillness English speakers, but keeping their conversation deliberately low. "Sure, this is the place?" One voice drifted up from below. "Eagle's been circling here for days." Old bastard's getting close to something he shouldn't. The words hit Stone Wolf like a physical blow. They knew about Ghostwing. They knew about him. This was not a chance encounter but a deliberate hunt, and he was the prey. Moving with the silent precision that had made him legendary among both Apache and cavalry, Stone Wolf worked his way back toward the cave entrance. If he was trapped in this canyon, at least he would be trapped with evidence that could expose the truth, assuming he lived long enough to share it with the outside world. The riders were closer now, their voices more distinct. Stone Wolf recognized the accent of one speaker, the particular drawl that marked him as a Texas cavalryman. During the Apache Wars, Texas volunteers had earned a reputation for brutality that disturbed even hardened frontier soldiers. If these men were connected to the atrocities he had discovered, their presence here boded ill for anyone seeking to uncover the truth. Tracks end at that side canyon, a new voice called out. He went in there. Good. Bottle him up. Been waiting 9 years for this opportunity. 9 years. The time frame was not coincidental. It matched exactly with Stone Wolf's retirement from Army service. Someone had been watching him, waiting for him to discover what they had hidden in these canyons. The question was whether they wanted to silence him or simply ensure that the truth remained buried along with the evidence. Stone Wolf felt in his pack for the items he had taken from the cave. A corroded dog tag that had caught his eye and several uniform buttons that bore clear unit markings. If he didn't survive this encounter, perhaps someone would eventually find these artifacts and understand their significance. The thought was cold comfort, but it was better than allowing the murders to remain forever hidden. The dog tag bore a name, Private Marcus Webb, 7th Cavalry. Stone Wolf closed his eyes and tried to remember if he had known the young soldier, but too many faces had passed through his memory during the war years. Webb had been someone's son, perhaps someone's husband, and he had died not in battle, but at the hands of his own comrades. The betrayal was almost too bitter to contemplate. Stone Wolf. The voice echoed off the canyon walls, carrying an authority that demanded attention. We know you're in there. Come out, and we can talk about this like civilized men. Stone Wolf almost laughed at the irony. Men who had committed mass murder and covered it up for nearly a decade were now calling for civilized conversation. But he remained silent, knowing that any response would only give away his exact position. We know what you found in there, the voice continued, and we know you're smart enough to understand what it means. But you're also smart enough to know that some secrets are better left buried. The speaker was closer now, probably at the mouth of the side canyon. Stone Wolf could hear the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs as the man dismounted. Professional soldiers, then, not merely hired guns. That made them more dangerous, but also more predictable. You served your country faithfully for 30 years, the voice went on, taking on a tone of reasoned persuasion. You earned respect and gratitude from men on both sides of the conflict. Why throw that away now for the sake of bones that have been moldering in the desert for nearly a decade? Because those bones had names, Stone Wolf thought grimly. Because they had been people with families and dreams and hopes for the future. Because justice delayed was not justice denied, merely justice waiting for the right moment to emerge. He heard movement at the canyon entrance, boots on stone as someone began working their way into the narrow passage. The tactical situation was simple. He was trapped in a dead-end canyon with at least 2 armed men blocking his escape. His advantages were knowledge of the terrain, familiarity with the cave system, and the element of surprise regarding what he had discovered. More importantly, he had Ghostwing. The eagle had been circling high above during the confrontation, but now Stone Wolf heard the distinctive whistle of diving wings. Ghostwing struck with the precision of a natural predator, talons raking across the face of the lead pursuer. The man's scream of pain and surprise echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the sound of a body hitting stone. Goddamn bird. Shoot it. Gunshots rang out, the reports magnified by the enclosed space. Stone Wolf used the distraction to move deeper into the cave system, following a narrow passage that led toward the back of the formation. He had noticed during his earlier exploration that the cave showed signs of natural ventilation, suggesting another opening somewhere in the rock face. Behind him, he could hear his pursuers regrouping. Johnson's hurt bad. Bird damn near took his eye out. Leave him. We came here to finish this, and by God, we're going to do it. What if he tells someone? What if word gets out? Word's not getting out. Not from him. Not from anyone else who might have heard something. This ends here. Today. Stone Wolf followed the passage deeper into the mountain, his oil lamp casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. The passage was narrow barely, wide enough for a man to pass through, but it showed clear signs of air movement. Somewhere ahead lay another exit, if he could reach it before his pursuers caught up. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and Stone Wolf's lamplight revealed something that made his blood run cold. More bones, more evidence of systematic murder, but these remains were different, smaller. The clothing remnants included women's dresses and children's shoes. A child's moccasin lay beside a pile of tiny bones, the leather still supple enough to reveal the intricate beadwork that marked it as Apache craftsmanship. Stone Wolf picked up the small shoe with trembling hands, recognizing the pattern his own grandmother had taught him decades ago. This child had been Apache, killed not in battle but in cold blood, along with family members whose only crime had been existing in a land that others coveted. The scope of the atrocity was staggering. This was not merely military misconduct, but genocide, systematic murder designed to eliminate entire bloodlines while maintaining the fiction of legitimate warfare. Stone Wolf felt tears running down his weathered cheeks as he contemplated the magnitude of what had been hidden in these caves. Found his lamp, a voice called from behind him. He's deeper in the cave system. Flush him out. You smoke if you have to. Stone Wolf tucked the child's moccasin into his pack alongside the other evidence. Whatever happened to him, these artifacts would tell the story of innocence destroyed and truth concealed. He pressed forward through the narrow passage, following the air current toward what he prayed would be salvation. Behind him, the voices of his pursuers grew fainter as they struggled through the confined space. But ahead lay uncertainty and the growing realization that he was carrying knowledge that powerful men would kill to suppress. Stone Wolf emerged from the cave system onto a ledge high above the canyon floor, gasping in the clean desert air after hours in the stifling passages. The pursuit had fallen behind, his trackers struggling through the narrow tunnels that he had navigated with the desperation of a hunted animal. But the respite was temporary. They would find the exit eventually, and when they did, he needed to be long gone. Ghostwind waited for him on the ledge, the eagle's amber eyes bright with what Stone Wolf could only interpret as approval. Blood stained the bird's talons from his attack on the pursuers, but he showed no sign of injury. The eagle had chosen his side in this conflict, and his loyalty was absolute. "Thank you, old friend," Stone Wolf murmured, checking his pack to ensure that the evidence remained secure. "Now we need to put some distance between us and those men." The ledge connected to a game trail that Stone Wolf recognized from his army days, a path that deer and elk had worn into the canyon wall over countless generations. It was treacherous footing, especially for a man of his age, but it offered the possibility of escape from the trap his pursuers had tried to spring. As he made his way along the narrow trail, Stone Wolf's mind wrestled with the full implications of what he had discovered. The bones in the caves represented more than individual murders. They spoke of a systematic campaign of extermination that had been hidden from official scrutiny for nearly a decade. The presence of women and children among the victims suggested that entire Apache families had been eliminated, their deaths covered up and attributed to other causes. The child's moccasin in his pack seemed to burn against his back, a tangible reminder of innocence destroyed. Stone Wolf remembered teaching Apache children to track and hunt, watching their faces light up as they mastered skills that connected them to their ancestors. Now he carried evidence that such children had been murdered by the very soldiers who claimed to be bringing civilization to the frontier. The beadwork on the moccasin was distinctive, marking it as the product of a specific family group that Stone Wolf recognized. The Tall Bear clan had been known for their intricate leatherwork, and this small shoe bore the characteristic patterns that mocked their craftsmanship. If his memory was correct, the Tall Bear family had disappeared during the winter of 1878. Their absence attributed to migration toward Mexico or death from disease. Now he knew the truth. They had been murdered and their bodies hidden in these remote canyons. Their deaths covered up to maintain the fiction that the Apache Wars were being conducted according to military protocol. The systematic nature of the concealment suggested official involvement at the highest levels. This was not the work of rogue soldiers acting without orders. Stone Wolf paused on the trail, overcome by the weight of complicity that settled on his shoulders like a burial shroud. Had he unknowingly assisted in tracking some of these victims? His skills as a scout had been used to locate Apache families throughout the territory, ostensibly for the purpose of returning them to the reservation. But how many of those families had actually reached their supposed destination? The questions brought back memories he had tried to suppress. Moments during his service when official reports had not quite matched his observations. Patrols that returned with no prisoners despite successful tracking operations. Apache camps found mysteriously abandoned with signs of violence but no bodies recovered. Discrepancies in casualty reports that he had attributed to the confusion of battle rather than deliberate deception. His grandmother had taught him that the earth remembered everything. That violence left stains that sensitive people could detect long after the events themselves had passed. She had also taught him that such knowledge came with responsibility. Those who could see the truth were obligated to speak it, regardless of the personal cost. The trail began to descend toward the canyon floor, following a series of switchbacks that offered concealment from observers below. Stone Wolf moved carefully, testing each step before committing his full weight. A fall here would end not only his life, but any chance of bringing the truth to light. As he descended, he caught glimpses of his pursuers through gaps in the rock formation. They had emerged from the cave system and were spreading out to search for his exit point. Their movements were professional, coordinated. These were not amateur killers, but experienced soldiers who understood how to conduct a manhunt. One of the searchers looked up toward his position, and Stone Wolf froze against the canyon wall. The man's face was partially obscured by shadow, but there was something familiar about his bearing that triggered recognition. Stone Wolf had seen that particular way of holding a rifle before, that distinctive scanning pattern that marked a particular training regimen. Captain James Morrison of the 7th Cavalry, if Stone Wolf's memory was correct. A career officer who had served with distinction during the Indian Wars, earning commendations for his tactical skill and leadership under fire. Stone Wolf had guided Morrison's patrols on several occasions, finding the captain to be professional and seemingly honorable. Yet here Morrison was 9 years after the end of the Apache Wars, hunting down a witness to atrocities that must have been committed under his command or with his knowledge. The betrayal was personal and devastating. Stone Wolf had trusted this man, had shared meals and conversation with him around campaign fires. The recognition brought with it a flood of memories that Stone Wolf had tried to keep buried. Morrison's unit had been responsible for several pacification operations in remote areas of the territory, missions that had been classified and whose details were never made public. At the time, Stone Wolf had assumed such secrecy was routine. military procedure. Now he understood that the classification had been designed to hide war crimes rather than protect legitimate operations. Morrison and his men had used their positions to conduct a private war of extermination, eliminating Apache families who posed no military threat and covering up their crimes with official reports that painted their victims as dangerous hostiles. Stone Wolf reached the canyon floor as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The shadows were growing longer, offering better concealment but also making navigation more treacherous. He needed to reach his cabin before full darkness, not only to escape his pursuers, but to preserve the evidence he carried. Behind him, he could hear Morrison's voice echoing off the canyon walls as the captain directed his men in the search. The tone was calm, professional, exactly what Stone Wolf remembered from their shared military service. It was chilling to realize how easily men could compartmentalize their actions, maintaining the facade of honor while committing acts that defied every principle they claimed to serve. Ghostwing circled overhead, his cry serving as both encouragement and warning. The eagle's presence was a reminder that some bonds transcended the corruption and betrayal that had poisoned human relationships. Whatever else happened, Stone Wolf could count on his feathered companion's loyalty. As he made his way through the gathering darkness, Stone Wolf felt the full weight of his Apache heritage settling around him like a spiritual mantle. His people had always understood that some truths were too important to remain hidden. That justice delayed was merely justice waiting for the right moment to emerge. The bones in the caves deserved better than anonymous burial in hidden tombs. The families who had disappeared deserved to have their fate known and their murderers held accountable. Most importantly, the children whose lives had been cut short deserved to have their stories told, their memories preserved beyond the reach of those who had tried to erase them from history. Stone Wolf quickened his pace, driven by purpose that transcended his own safety. He was no longer just a retired scout trying to live out his remaining years in peace. He was the keeper of terrible knowledge, the witness to atrocities that demanded acknowledgement and justice. Stone Wolf reached his cabin as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, but the familiar sanctuary no longer felt safe. The confrontation in the canyons had changed everything, transforming his peaceful retreat into a potential trap. Morrison and his men knew where he lived, and they would not hesitate to finish what they had started in the caves. He lit a single oil lamp and began gathering the items he would need for an extended journey into the wilderness. His old army pack, already prepared, would carry the evidence he had collected along with supplies for survival in hostile territory. But first, he needed to examine what he had found more carefully, to understand the full scope of what Morrison was trying to hide. Stone Wolf spread the artifacts on his rough wooden table, studying them in the lamplight with the methodical attention he had once given to tracking hostile sign. The corroded dog tag bearing Private Webb's name was just the beginning among the uniform. Buttons and belt buckles were items that told a more complete story of systematic murder and concealment. A captain's insignia caught his attention, the metal tarnished but still bearing clear unit markings. 7th Cavalry, just as he had suspected, but with a twist that made his blood run cold. The insignia bore the distinctive marks that identified it as belonging to a specific company within the regiment, Morrison's company. But it was the discovery of water-damaged papers tucked inside a rotting leather portfolio that truly revealed the magnitude of the conspiracy. The pages were partially illegible, the ink faded and running, but enough remained to tell a chilling story of orders given and atrocities committed in the name of territorial security. Stone Wolf carefully separated the fragile pages, his eyes straining to make out the faded handwriting. What he could decipher made his hands tremble with rage and sorrow. Double quotes, ... families, eliminated as authorized ... Number survivors to spread word of our operations. Official reports will list casualties as hostile combatants killed in legitimate military action. The signature at the bottom was partially obscured, but Stonewolf could make out enough letters to confirm his worst suspicions. Captain James Morrison had not merely participated in the murders, he had ordered them, documenting his crimes with the bureaucratic precision that marked his military training. More disturbing still were references to other participants in the conspiracy, names that Stonewolf recognized from his years of service. Lieutenant Samuel Hayes, Sergeant William Crawford, and most shocking of all, a reference to the Apache scout who had provided tracking services for several of the operations. Wolf's world tilted on its axis as the implication struck him. He had not merely been a witness to these atrocities, he had been an unwitting participant, his skills used to locate the very families who had later been murdered. The tracking missions he remembered, the ones where families had mysteriously vanished before army patrols arrived, had been preparation for systematic elimination. The knowledge was devastating, striking at the very core of his identity. Stonewolf had always taken pride in his ability to serve as a bridge between two worlds, using his skills to prevent unnecessary bloodshed rather than facilitate it. Now he discovered that his efforts at peacekeeping had been perverted into an instrument of genocide. He sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the weight of complicity that settled on his shoulders like a crushing burden. How many families had he tracked to their deaths? How many children had died because of information he had provided to officers he trusted? The child's moccasin seemed to mock him from its place among the other artifacts, a reminder of innocence destroyed and trust betrayed. Stonewolf picked up the small shoe, studying the intricate beadwork through tears that blurred his vision. Somewhere in his memory, he could almost recall tracking this family, following their trail through difficult terrain while believing he was helping to return them safely to the reservation. Instead, he had delivered them to murderers, ghost wings. A cry from outside the cabin broke through his spiral of self-recrimination. The eagle's warning was sharp and urgent, indicating approaching danger. Stonewolf quickly gathered the artifacts and stuffed them back into his pack, extinguishing the lamp as the sound of horses reached his ears. Through the cabin's single window, he could see the glow of torches moving up the mesa trail. Morrison had found him, as Stonewolf had known he would. The captain was nothing if not persistent, and he would not allow a witness to his crimes to escape justice, or rather, his version of justice. Stonewolf shouldered his pack and moved toward the cabin's rear exit, a door that opened onto a narrow ledge overlooking the canyon below. The drop was significant but manageable for someone with his experience, and it would take Morrison's men time to circle the mesa and cut off his escape route. As he prepared to leave, Stonewolf's eyes fell on his medicine pouch, still sitting on the mantel where it had remained throughout his years of retirement. The worn leather bag contained the sacred items of his Apache heritage alongside the military medals that marked his service to the American Army. The contradiction that had once torn at his soul now seemed prophetic. He had indeed walked between two worlds, and now both were demanding their due. He took the medicine pouch and hung it around his neck, feeling the weight of his dual identity settle into familiar patterns. The Apache warrior and the American scout were no longer in conflict. They had merged into something new, something dangerous to those who had betrayed the trust of both peoples. The sound of boots on the porch told him that his time had run out. Morrison's voice carried clearly through the thin cabin walls, calm and reasonable as always. "Stonewolf, we know you're in there. Come out and let's discuss this situation like civilized men. There's no need for anyone else to get hurt." The irony was not lost on the old scout. Men who had systematically murdered women and children were now appealing to civilization and reason. But he remained silent, using the distraction of Morrison's words to slip out the back door and onto the narrow ledge. The night air was cool against his face as he began his descent, finding handholds and footholds with the skill born of decades. In rough country, above him, he could hear Morrison's men breaking down his front door, their boots thundering across the wooden floor as they searched for their quarry. "He's gone. Back door is open. Find him. He can't have gotten far." But Stone Wolf was already moving across the canyon floor, following paths that only he knew existed. His intimate knowledge of this terrain was his greatest advantage. Morrison might be a competent officer, but he was not a tracker of Stone Wolf's caliber. As he made his way through the darkness, guided by starlight and instinct, Stone Wolf found himself thinking about the journal pages he had discovered. The references to other operations, other victims, suggested that the murders in the cave were only part of a larger pattern of atrocities. How many other burial sites were scattered across the territory? How many other families had vanished without explanation? The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, reaching implications that extended far beyond a few rogue soldiers acting without orders. The systematic nature of the cover-up suggested involvement at the highest levels of the military hierarchy, possibly extending into the territorial government itself. Stone Wolf understood now why Morrison was so desperate to silence him. The captain was not merely protecting himself from prosecution. He was safeguarding a conspiracy that could bring down careers and reputations throughout the territory. The stakes were high enough to justify any level of violence to maintain secrecy. But knowledge brought responsibility, and Stone Wolf could no longer retreat into the comfortable isolation that had protected him for 9 years. The bones in the caves had names. The artifacts told stories that demanded to be heard, and the truth would not remain buried simply because it was inconvenient for powerful men. As he moved through the familiar landscape of his exile, Stone Wolf felt the warrior spirit of his ancestors stirring within him. This was no longer about personal survival. It was about justice for the murdered families, accountability for those who had betrayed their oaths, and truth for a territory built on lies and covered-up atrocities. Behind him, torches bobbed through the darkness as Morrison's men spread out to search for his trail. They would find it eventually. Stone Wolf was good, but he was not invisible, and they had numbers on their side. But he no longer needed to escape permanently, only long enough to ensure that the evidence he carried would reach the right people. Ghostwings' cry echoed across the canyon, a sound that seemed to carry the voices of all the murdered innocents demanding justice. Stone Wolf quickened his pace, driven by purpose that transcended his own mortality. He had spent 9 years trying to forget the weight of his dual heritage, and now that weight had become his strength. The old scout was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. Stone Wolf was done running from the past. Now he would force the past to confront its crimes. Stone Wolf made camp in a hidden alcove, 10 miles from his burned cabin, the smoke still visible on the horizon as a reminder of Morrison's thoroughness. The captain had not been content with simply searching the structure. He had eliminated it entirely, erasing the last traces of Stone Wolf's peaceful retirement along with any evidence that might have been left behind. But Morrison had made a crucial mistake. In his haste to destroy potential evidence, he had revealed the true scope of his desperation and the resources at his disposal. Burning an isolated cabin required men and materials that suggested official backing, not the actions of a few rogue soldiers trying to cover up old crimes. As Stone Wolf examined his remaining supplies by the light of a carefully concealed fire, he heard Ghostwing's distinctive cry from the darkness beyond his camp. The eagle had been ranging ahead, scouting the territory with the thoroughness that had made their partnership so effective. Now he was returning with news that Stone Wolf could read in the urgency of his call. The eagle landed on a dead branch. Near the alcove, something clutched in his powerful talons. In the firelight, Stone Wolf could see that it was not prey, but another artifact, a piece of paper that looked recent, its edges crisp despite the desert wind. Stonewolf took the paper, carefully unfolding it to reveal a photograph that made his blood freeze in his veins. The image showed a group of men in civilian dress, posed around a table in what appeared to be an expensive hotel or gentleman's club. The setting was clearly recent. The clothing styles and photographic quality spoke of modern techniques, not the crude images of the frontier period. But it was the faces that struck Stonewolf like a physical blow. Front and center sat Captain James Morrison, now dressed in expensive civilian clothing that marked him as a man of means and position. His hair was silver with age, his face lined by time, but the cruel intelligence in his eyes remained unchanged. From their last encounter 9 years ago, beside Morrison sat other faces that Stonewolf recognized from his military service. Lieutenant Hayes, now apparently bearing the insignia of a territorial judge, and Sergeant Crawford, whose expensive suit suggested considerable prosperity since his army days. The gathering had the look of a reunion. Old comrades celebrating their continued success and mutual prosperity. Dot at the bottom of the photograph, written in careful script, were the words, "Annual Gathering of the Territorial Development Association, Tucson, October 1887. Below that, in Morrison's distinctive handwriting, "To continued prosperity and permanent silence." Stonewolf studied the image more closely, recognizing the implications of what Ghostwing had discovered. This was not merely evidence of Morrison's survival and prosperity. It was proof that the conspiracy he had uncovered extended far into the present day. The men who had committed atrocities during the Apache Wars had not faded into obscurity, but had used their crimes as stepping stones to positions of power and influence in territorial society. Morrison's transformation from army captain to what appeared to be a wealthy businessman was particularly disturbing. How had a career soldier acquired the resources to join the territorial elite? The answer lay in the systematic looting that had accompanied the murders. Apache silver, stolen cattle, and the blood money paid by those who benefited from the elimination of inconvenient native populations. But the photograph revealed something even more sinister than individual corruption. The Territorial Development Association was a name Stonewolf recognized from newspaper articles he had read during his years of retirement. The organization was credited with bringing civilization and prosperity to Arizona Territory, building railroads and establishing mining operations that had transformed the region. Now he understood the true foundation of that prosperity. The association had not merely developed empty land. They had emptied populated land through systematic murder, then claimed it for their own purposes. The Apache families buried in the hidden caves had not died as casualties of war, but as obstacles to profitable development. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This was not merely military misconduct, but organized criminal enterprise operating under the cover of territorial development. Morrison and his associates had used their positions in the army to eliminate native populations, then leveraged their crimes into positions of civilian authority that allowed them to profit from their atrocities. Stonewolf felt the weight of the medicine pouch around his neck, the sacred items of his heritage mixing with the metals of his military service. The contradiction that had once tormented him now seemed prophetic. He had indeed served two masters, and both had betrayed the principles they claimed to represent. The photograph also explained Morrison's desperate pursuit and the resources at his disposal. This was not merely about covering up old war crimes, but about protecting a criminal enterprise that continued to generate enormous profits. The men in the photograph had too much to lose to allow a witness to survive, regardless of the cost, in blood and violence. Ghostwing moved restlessly on his perch, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight as he watched the darkness beyond their camp. The eagle's behavior suggested approaching danger, but Stonewolf needed time to understand the full implications of what they had discovered. He turned the photograph over and found additional writing on the back, a list of names and locations that made his hands tremble with recognition. These were Apache burial grounds, sacred sites that his people had maintained for countless generations. Next to each location was a notation that spoke of mining claims, railroad rights-of-way, and development projects. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Morrison's association had systematically identified and desecrated Apache sacred sites, using their knowledge of native customs to locate areas that could be profitably exploited. The burial grounds had been strip-mined for silver and turquoise. The sacred springs had been diverted for mining operations, and the ceremonial sites had been dynamited to make way for railroad tracks. But the most damning notation was beside a location Stonewolf knew intimately, the canyon where he had discovered the mass graves. Next to it was written, "Primary burial site secured. Development to commence 1888. Estimated silver yield, 200,000 troy ounces." They had known about the mass grave all along. More than that, they had chosen the location precisely because it was a natural burial ground, using the sanctity of the site to hide their crimes while planning to desecrate it further for profit. The cynicism was breathtaking, even by the standards of frontier brutality. Stonewolf understood now why Morrison had been so desperate to prevent discovery of the burial caves. It was not merely about hiding old murders, but about protecting future profits. The association had invested considerable resources in preparing the site for mining operations, and any investigation into the human remains would expose not only their past crimes, but their ongoing plans. The sound of approaching horses cut through the night air, multiple riders moving with the confidence of men who knew their quarry was trapped. Morrison had found his trail again, using resources and manpower that confirmed Stonewolf's growing understanding of the conspiracy's reach. But this time, Stonewolf was not merely running from individual pursuit. He was fleeing from an organization. With the resources of a criminal empire and the protection of territorial authority, the men hunting him were not just covering up old crimes. They were protecting an ongoing enterprise built on murder and theft. Ghostwing took flight. As the first torch appeared in the distance, his powerful wings carrying him into the darkness, where he could observe and report on their pursuers' movements. Stonewolf gathered his pack and prepared to move deeper into the wilderness. But he no longer had any illusions about the nature of his situation. He was not merely a witness to historical atrocities. He was a threat to a continuing conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial society. Morrison and his associates would not stop hunting him until he was dead, and they had the resources to pursue him across the entire Southwest. But Stonewolf had something they lacked: absolute moral clarity about what needed to be done. The photograph in his pack was more than evidence of individual corruption. It was proof of systematic evil that demanded exposure regardless of the personal cost. The old scout who had sought peaceful retirement was gone forever. In his place stood something harder and more dangerous: an Apache warrior carrying the truth that would either destroy his enemies or consume him in the attempt. The hunt was no longer about survival. It was about justice, and Stonewolf intended to see it through to the end. 3 days of running through the high desert had brought Stonewolf to the sacred valley where his vision quest had first revealed his destiny as a bridge between worlds. The irony was not lost on him. He had come full circle, returning to the place where his spiritual journey had begun to face what might be its conclusion. The valley was hidden deep in the Chiricahua Mountains, accessible only through passes that few white men had ever discovered. Stonewolf's grandfather had brought him here as a boy to learn the old stories, and his grandmother had taught him the ceremonies that connected the living to the spirits of the ancestors. If there was anywhere on earth where he could find the strength for what lay ahead, it was here. Stonewolf knelt beside the sacred spring that bubbled from living rock, cupping the clear water in his hands and drinking deeply. The taste was exactly as he remembered, clean and cold, carrying the essence of the mountain's heart. This water had sustained his people for generations beyond counting, and it would sustain him now in his final preparation for battle. He had not come here merely to hide or to seek sanctuary. The artifacts in his pack, the photograph, the corroded dog tags, the child's moccasin, the damning journal pages represented more than evidence of individual crimes. They were testimony to a systematic evil that had poisoned the relationship between peoples and perverted the noble ideals that both Apache and American cultures claimed to represent. But evidence alone would not be enough to bring down Morrison's criminal empire. The territorial authorities were compromised, the military hierarchy was complicit, and the newspapers were controlled by the very men who had profited from the atrocities. Stone Wolf needed more than proof. He needed a way to force the truth into the light where it could not be suppressed or explained away. From his pack, Stone Wolf removed his father's war lance, a weapon that had been carried by Apache warriors for 3 generations. The ashwood shaft was worn smooth by countless hands, and the steel point still gleamed with the oil his father had used to prevent rust. This lance had drawn blood in the defense of sacred places and innocent people, and now it would serve that purpose one final time. But first, Stone Wolf needed to prepare himself according to the old ways, to seek guidance from the spirits of those who had walked this path before him. He built a small fire from sacred wood and began the purification ceremony that would cleanse his spirit and sharpen his resolve. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, Stone Wolf painted his face with the war colors that marked him as a defender of his people. The red ochre symbolized the blood of the innocent that demanded justice, while the white clay represented the purity of purpose that would guide his actions. The black charcoal around his eyes would help him see clearly in the darkness of battle and in the moral shadows where his enemies operated. Ghostwing watched these preparations with the stillness that marked sacred moments. The eagle's amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that transcended mere animal awareness. The bird had been more than a companion during their years together. He had been a guide, leading Stone Wolf to the truth that others had tried to hide. Now, as the final confrontation approached, the eagle's presence served as a reminder that some bonds transcended the corruption that had poisoned human relationships. The ceremony continued through the night as Stone Wolf communed with the spirits of his ancestors, seeking their wisdom and blessing for the task ahead. In the flickering firelight, he could almost see their faces, his grandfather, who had taught him to read the signs written in earth and sky, his grandmother, whose stories had preserved the ancient wisdom, his father, whose lance now rested across his knees as a symbol of inherited responsibility. But it was the spirits of the murdered innocents who spoke most clearly to his heart. The families buried in the hidden caves, the children whose lives had been cut short by Morrison's greed, the women who had died protecting babies who would never grow to carry on their bloodlines. Their voices rose from the darkness like a chorus demanding justice. Stone Wolf understood now that his role as a bridge between worlds had not ended with his retirement from military service. Instead, it had evolved into something more dangerous and more necessary. He had become the instrument through which the dead would speak to the living, the means by which justice would be delivered to those who thought themselves beyond its reach. As dawn approached, Stone Wolf completed his preparations by writing out a detailed account of everything he had discovered. The testament filled several pages with careful script, documenting not only the physical evidence, but the systematic nature of the conspiracy and its ongoing threat to both Apache and American communities. He sealed the document in a waterproof pouch and attached it to a message arrow that he would fire toward the valley's entrance before the final confrontation began. If he did not survive what was to come, at least the truth would have a chance of reaching someone with the courage to act upon it. The sound of approaching horses echoed from the valley's mouth as Morrison and his men found the entrance to the sacred place. They came openly now, no longer concerned with stealth or secrecy. Their torches gutted the pre-dawn darkness like wounds in the sky, and their voices carried the confidence of men who believed themselves on the verge of final victory. Stone Wolf counted at least a dozen riders, more than Morrison had brought to their previous encounters. The captain was taking no chances this time, bringing enough firepower to overwhelm any resistance and eliminate any possibility of escape. But numbers alone would not determine the outcome of this confrontation. The spiritual power of the sacred valley and the righteousness of his cause would weigh heavily in the balance. Stone Wolf. Morrison's voice rang out across the valley, amplified by the natural acoustics of the rock formations. This has gone far enough. Come out and face me like the warrior you claim to be. The challenge was deliberate, calculated to appeal to Stone Wolf's Apache heritage and his sense of honor. Morrison understood his quarry well enough to know that running and hiding were alien to the warrior spirit, that a direct challenge would be difficult to ignore. But Stone Wolf had learned patience during his years of exile, and he would not be rushed into premature action. He remained hidden in the rocks above the valley floor, observing his enemy's deployment and waiting for the moment when their confidence would become overconfidence. Morrison's men spread out across the valley in a professional manner that confirmed Stone Wolf's assessment of their military background. These were not mere hired guns, but experienced soldiers who understood tactics and terrain. Several of them carried repeating rifles that could deliver devastating firepower at long range, while others bore the shorter weapons more suitable for close combat. But they also moved with the arrogance of men who had grown accustomed to easy victories over helpless victims. The families they had murdered in the caves had been unable to fight back, had been betrayed by those they trusted, and slaughtered before they could even understand their danger. Morrison's men had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy who could strike back. Stone Wolf notched an arrow to his bowstring and took careful aim at the message pouch he had prepared. The shot would alert his enemies to his position, but it would also ensure that his testament reached safety regardless of what followed. The truth would survive even if he did not. The arrow flew straight and true, carrying its precious cargo toward a hidden cache where friendly eyes might eventually find it. Morrison's men reacted to the shot with professional speed, their weapons swinging toward the source of the projectile. But Stone Wolf was already moving to a new position among the rocks. "Clever old man," Morrison called out, his voice carrying a note of grudging respect. "But cleverness won't save you from what you've brought on yourself. You should have stayed retired, should have kept your nose out of things that didn't concern you." Stone Wolf's reply echoed from the valley walls, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Those children in the caves concern me, Morrison. Their blood cries out for justice, and their spirits will not rest until it is delivered." "Children die in wars," Morrison responded, his tone becoming harder. "That's the price of building civilization in savage country. You of all people should understand that you helped us bring order to this territory." "I helped you track families for slaughter," Stone Wolf corrected, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty. "I helped you commit murder. And call it war. But no more. Today the debt comes due." Morrison's laugh was ugly, devoid of genuine humor. "You're one old Apache against a dozen armed men. What do you think you can accomplish besides dying a hero's death for no good reason?" Stone Wolf's answer came not in words but in action, his war lance flying through the morning air to pin one of Morrison's men to the trunk of an ancient oak. The man's scream of pain and surprise echoed across the valley, followed by the thunder of gunfire as his companions opened fire on shadows and phantoms. The battle for the sacred valley had begun, and with it, the final reckoning for crimes that had festered in darkness for too long. The sacred valley erupted into chaos as Morrison's men sought cover from an enemy they could not see. Stone Wolf moved through the rocks like a ghost, using every skill he had learned during 30 years of warfare to confuse and demoralize his pursuers. His arrows came from impossible angles, striking with deadly precision before their source could be located. Morrison's tactical training was evident in how quickly he regrouped his scattered men, but Stonewolf had chosen his battleground with the wisdom of a lifetime spent studying terrain and its advantages. The valley's rock formations created natural firing positions and concealed approaches that allowed a single defender to hold off a much larger force, provided that defender possessed the skills and determination to use them effectively. "Spread out," Morrison shouted, his voice cutting through the echoes of gunfire. "Form a skirmish line and advance by sections. He's just one man, we can overwhelm him through coordinated fire." But coordinated fire required targets, and Stonewolf refused to provide them. He struck like lightning and vanished like smoke, leaving behind only the evidence of his presence in the form of wounded enemies and growing fear among the survivors. Each successful attack eroded the confidence that Morrison's men had brought to the valley, replacing it with the nervous tension that marked soldiers facing an enemy they could not predict or counter. From his position among the sacred stones, Stonewolf could see the bag of silver coins that had spilled from one of the wounded men's packs. The coins bore the distinctive markings of Apache silverwork, metal that had been torn from the bodies of murdered innocents and turned into payment for their killers. The sight filled him with cold rage that transcended personal survival and elevated the battle into something approaching divine judgment. Morrison himself had taken cover behind a massive boulder near the valley's center, his expensive civilian clothes now torn and dusty from scrambling across rough ground. The transformation from territorial dignitary to desperate fugitive was almost complete, stripping away the facade of respectability to reveal the frightened killer beneath. "This doesn't have to end in more bloodshed," Morrison called out, his voice betraying the strain of the situation. "We can make a deal. You keep silent about what you found, and we'll make it worth your while. Think about it. Stonewolf enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your days. No questions asked about the past." Stonewolf's reply came in the form of another arrow, this one passing so close to Morrison's head that it severed several strands of his silver hair. The message was clear. There would be no bargaining with the murdered dead. No price that could purchase silence about atrocities that demanded exposure. Ghostwing joined the battle with the fury of a natural predator, protecting his territory. The eagle dove from the heights to rake the faces of Morrison's men with razor-sharp talons, his cries echoing off the valley walls like war songs. Several soldiers fled their positions rather than face the aerial assault, breaking the careful formation that Morrison was trying to maintain. "Kill that damned bird," Morrison screamed, his composure finally cracking under the pressure of a battle that was not going according to his plans. "Shoot it down!" But Ghostwing was too fast and too clever to be brought down by panicked gunfire. The eagle had learned from Stonewolf the art of using terrain to his advantage, striking from unexpected angles and disappearing before return fire could find its mark. Each attack further demoralized enemies, who were discovering that nature itself had joined the fight against them. Stonewolf used the distraction of Ghostwing's assault to move closer to Morrison's position, working his way through the rocks with the patience of a hunter who knew that hasty action led to failure. The captain had made a tactical error by choosing the center of the valley for his defensive position. It offered good fields of fire in all directions, but it also left him exposed to attack from the higher ground that Stonewolf commanded. As he moved, Stonewolf felt the presence of his ancestors guiding his steps and steadying his aim. This valley had been sacred to his people for generations beyond counting, and the spirits of Apache warriors who had fallen defending their homeland were rising to join the battle. Morrison and his men were not merely fighting one old scout. They were facing the accumulated wrath of all those who had died unavenged. The bag of silver coins caught the morning sunlight as it lay scattered across the rocky ground, its contents gleaming like drops of blood in the desert sun. Each coin represented a life taken, a family destroyed, a future stolen by men who valued profit of human dignity. The weight of that accumulated evil was pressing down on the valley like a thundercloud, and Stonewolf could feel the storm building toward its inevitable climax. Morrison's men were beginning to break, their military discipline eroding under the pressure of fighting an enemy who seemed to strike from everywhere at once. 2 more had fallen to Stonewolf's arrows, and several others bore wounds from Ghostwing's attacks. The confident hunters who had entered the valley were being transformed into desperate prey, and Morrison's authority was cracking under the strain. The final phase of the battle was approaching, and Stonewolf prepared himself for the moment when subtlety would give way to direct confrontation. Morrison would have to be faced directly, man to man, in a reckoning that would determine not only their individual fates, but the future of justice in the territory. Stonewolf emerged from the rocks like an apparition of vengeance, his war-painted face terrible in the morning light. Morrison's remaining men, fewer than half of the force that had entered the valley with such confidence, scrambled for their weapons as the figure they had been hunting finally revealed himself. But it was Morrison himself who drew Stonewolf's attention, the captain standing with military bearing despite the chaos that surrounded him. His expensive clothes were torn and bloodied, his silver hair disheveled, but his eyes still held the cold intelligence that had made him so dangerous during the Apache Wars. "So you finally come out to face me," Morrison said, raising his rifle with steady hands. "I wondered if you still had the warrior's courage, or if retirement had made you soft." Stonewolf advanced with measured steps, his father's warlance held in a grip that spoke of generations of martial tradition. The weapon seemed to pulse with spiritual energy in his hands, as if the spirits of all who had wielded it before were lending their strength to this final confrontation. "Courage?" Stonewolf's voice carried across the valley like the rumble of distant thunder. "You speak of courage while surrounded by the evidence of your crimes against women and children. The only courage here is that of the innocents who died, refusing to betray their people to monsters like you." Morrison's shot rang out, the bullet passing close enough to Stonewolf's head that he felt the wind of its passage. But the old scout did not falter, his advance continuing with the inexorable patience of natural justice. Around them, Morrison's surviving men watched in fascination and terror as their leader faced the ghost of his own past. "You were always self-righteous," Morrison snarled, working the bolt of his rifle to chamber another round. "Always convinced that you understood the moral complexities of frontier warfare better than those of us, who had to make the hard decisions. But you participated in every operation, Stonewolf. Your hands are just as bloody as mine." "My hands are stained with the blood of enemies who chose to fight," Stonewolf replied, his pace never slowing. "Your hands drip with the blood of innocents who trusted you to protect them. The difference between us is the difference between a warrior and a butcher." Morrison's second shot went wide, his aim disturbed by the approaching figure that seemed to embody all the guilt and fear he had spent 9 years trying to suppress. He reached for his sidearm, but his hands were shaking now, the steadiness of command replaced by the trembling of a man who finally understood that his crimes had caught up with him. It was then that Ghostwing made his final contribution to the Timmy's battle, diving from the heights to strike Morrison's gun hand with surgical precision. The captain's scream of pain echoed across the valley as the eagle's talons opened deep wounds, sending the weapon spinning from nerveless fingers. Stonewolf covered the remaining distance in 3 swift strides, his war lance finding its mark with the certainty of divine judgment. Morrison looked down at the steel point protruding from his chest with an expression of surprise, as if he had never truly believed that this moment would come. "The children in the caves send their regards," Stonewolf said quietly, his voice carrying a finality that seemed to settle over the valley like a shroud. Morrison tried to speak, blood frothing from his lips as his body fought against the wound that would soon claim his life. But no words came, only the rattling breath of a man whose time for explanations had passed. He fell to his knees, then forward onto his face, his blood mingling with the sacred earth he had tried to desecrate. The surviving members of Morrison's force stood frozen in shock, their weapons lowered as they stared at the body of their leader. Without Morrison's authority to drive them forward, they seemed uncertain of their purpose, like actors in a play whose director had suddenly departed. Stone Wolf pulled his lance free and turned to face the remaining killers, his war paint streaked with sweat but his resolve undiminished. Ghostwing perched on a nearby rock, preening his feathers as if the violent death he had helped to deliver was simply another successful hunt. "Your captain is dead," Stone Wolf announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the valley. "The man who ordered the murder of innocents and the desecration of sacred places has paid the price for his crimes. Now you must choose continue his work and share his fate, or leave this place and never return." From his belt, Stone Wolf drew a sacred eagle feather, one of the most holy objects in Apache tradition. Ghostwing had given it to him years ago, a gift that sealed the bond between human and eagle in a partnership that transcended the ordinary relationships between species. "This valley is protected by spirits older than your government and more powerful than your guns," Stone Wolf continued, holding the feather high so that all could see. "Take word back to those who sent you. The murdered dead have found their voice, and justice will not be denied." One by one, Morrison's surviving men began to retreat, their appetite for violence extinguished by the demonstration of what happened to those who defiled sacred places and murdered innocents. They would carry word of Morrison's death back to his criminal associates, and that word would spread fear through the ranks of those who had profited from atrocities. The battle was over, but the war for justice was just beginning. 6 months after the battle in the Sacred Valley, Stone Wolf stood before the newly erected memorial that marked the mass grave where Morrison's victims had finally been laid to rest with proper ceremony. The territorial government, faced with evidence that could no longer be suppressed or explained away, had been forced to acknowledge the atrocities and provide some measure of official recognition for the murdered innocents. The memorial was simple, but dignified, a circle of standing stones arranged according to Apache tradition, with smaller markers bearing the names of those victims who could be identified. At the center stood a larger stone inscribed with words that Stone Wolf had composed himself. "Here lie the innocents who died so that others might profit." Their voices cry out across time for justice and remembrance. The investigation that followed Morrison's death had exposed the full scope of the Territorial Development Association's criminal enterprise. Faced with documented evidence of systematic murder and theft, several prominent territorial officials had resigned in disgrace. Others had fled to Mexico or California, abandoning their ill-gotten gains rather than face prosecution. But Stone Wolf knew that justice was more complex than simple punishment. The families buried in these graves could not be restored to life. The children could not be returned to their parents. And the cultural treasures that had been looted and destroyed could never be fully replaced. What mattered now was ensuring that their stories would be remembered and that such atrocities would never again be hidden from public scrutiny. Ghostwing perched on the memorial's central stone, his amber eyes surveying the surrounding landscape, with the eternal vigilance that had first led them to uncover the truth. The eagle had aged during their months of struggle, his feathers showing more white than before, but his spirit remained as fierce as ever. He had become something of a legend among both Apache and white communities, the bird who had helped expose one of the territory's greatest crimes. Stone Wolf carried with him a leather portfolio containing his complete written testament, the document that had survived Morrison's attempts at suppression and had ultimately brought the truth to light. The pages detailed not only the physical evidence of the murders, but the systematic nature of the cover-up and the ongoing threat posed by those who had profited from genocide. The territorial newspaper had published extensive excerpts from his account, and copies had been sent to officials in Washington who were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about how such atrocities could have remained hidden for so long. The story had sparked investigations in other territories, revealing a pattern of corruption and violence that extended far beyond Arizona's borders. But for Stone Wolf, the most meaningful victory was not the official recognition or the newspaper headlines. It was the quiet ceremony that had taken place at dawn, when Apache elders had performed the proper burial rites for the murdered families and sung the ancient songs that would guide their spirits to the afterlife. The dead could finally rest, knowing that their fate was acknowledged and their killers had been held accountable. The child's moccasin that had haunted Stone Wolf's dreams now rested in a place of honor at the memorial, along with other personal artifacts that had been recovered from the burial caves. Each item told a story of a life cut short, a future stolen, a family destroyed by greed and hatred. But they also told a story of survival, truth enduring despite all attempts to suppress it, justice emerging despite all efforts to prevent it. Stone Wolf had built a new cabin near the memorial site, abandoning his former refuge on the mesa for a home that allowed him to serve as guardian and interpreter for the steady stream of visitors who came to pay their respects. Some were Apache families seeking to honor their murdered relatives. Others were white settlers and officials trying to understand how such horrors had been committed in their name. Each visitor left changed by what they learned, carrying with them a deeper understanding of the true cost of the territory's development and the importance of vigilance against those who would exploit ethnic divisions for personal gain. The memorial had become more than a grave marker. It was a place of education and reconciliation, where painful truths were acknowledged and honored rather than hidden or denied. As the sun set behind the surrounding peaks, Stone Wolf performed the evening ritual that had become his daily practice. He lit a small fire using sacred wood and offered prayers for the murdered innocents, asking their spirits to find peace now that justice had been served. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, carrying his words toward the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. Ghostwings settled beside him on the stone circle, the eagle's presence a reminder of the partnership that had made this victory possible. Together, they had bridged the gap between two worlds, using skills learned in service to violence to ultimately serve the cause of truth and justice. The contradiction that had once torn at Stone Wolf's soul had been resolved at last. He was neither fully Apache nor fully American, but something new and necessary, a guardian of truth in a world that preferred comfortable lies. In his final years, Stone Wolf had found a purpose that transcended the conflicts of his youth and the isolation of his middle age. He was no longer a scout serving conflicting masters or exile hiding from painful memories. He was a keeper of sacred truth, ensuring that the voices of the murdered innocents would continue to speak across the generations. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the same constellations that had guided his ancestors across countless centuries and would continue to guide future generations in their search for justice and understanding. Stone Wolf felt the weight of his medicine pouch against his chest, the sacred items and military medals finally at peace with each other in the service of a greater cause. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new questions, new opportunities to share the story that had nearly been lost forever. But tonight belonged to the spirits of the dead and the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled. Stone Wolf closed his eyes and listened to the desert wind, hearing in its whisper the voices of all those who had died so that the truth might eventually emerge. The past had indeed found him, as he had known it would, but instead of destroying him, it had transformed him into something he had never expected to become, a man at peace with himself and his place in the great web of existence that connected all living things. Ghostwing's soft cry echoed across the memorial site, a sound that seemed to carry the blessing of the ancestors and the promise that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. In the gathering darkness, man and eagle maintained their vigil over the sacred ground, guardians of memory and servants of justice in a world that still struggled to understand the true meaning of both.